Oh, okay.
So now people start streaming in.
No, that way.
Welcome to everybody joining us. Feel free to tell us where you're coming from in the chat so we can see how wide-ranging our guests are today. We'll get started in about 10 minutes. This is kind of your sound check, and periodically I'll say something before we start so you'll know that your sound should be working. Oh, we got Rachel from New Jersey, Billy Thomas from Lexington, Kentucky, Dorian from Lewisburg, West Virginia, Clyde from Fayette County, Pennsylvania, Ernest from Garrett County, Maryland, Rachel from Northern New York. So kind of wide balance already. Bud from Indiana, who I know Bud's joined some of these before. We've got Dallas from upstate New York, Joel from Virginia, and Clell from Hillsborough. Oh, Chris, you're the farthest from Palmer, Alaska. Carl, welcome from Exton, Pennsylvania. Yes, there are a lot of Yankees here. We have Zhu Lee from Columbus, Ohio, and David from Thomasville, Alabama. Bonus prize to the first person who's from a different country. We'll see. We got Rick from Peachtree City, Georgia, and Barbara from Sand Lake, New York. And just so you can see on the screen, we've got the whole schedule for this webinar series, which is hosted by a multi-state team of forestry extension professionals from all over. So this is the first webinar in the series. We got Pamela from Lebanon and Kitty from Thompson, Connecticut, Dennis Harrison from Charlotte, North Carolina, or actually I said Harrison Dennis, vice versa. If you're looking for any of the webinars, this is the 6th year of this Woodland Stewards webinar series. And so you can go to this web address, which I'll put in the chat later, and find any other webinar series. There was a series in 2021 on timber taxes, which applies to any kind of land and is useful for any kind of landowner. So it's worth checking out. Just FYI. And for those of you who are if you want a certificate for this webinar and to reach the evaluation, which we appreciate if you can fill out, you'll need to go back to this screen where you saw the green boxes and then press complete the webinar, and that will allow you to get a certificate of attendance or continuing education units and take you to our evaluation. Welcome to Linda from Elkins, West Virginia. This series is brought to you by a multi-state team. So we have folks from North Carolina State Extension, University of Georgia Extension, Clemson Cooperative Extension, Virginia Cooperative Extension, University of Missouri, University of Kentucky, Mississippi State, as well as folks from Cornell University Extension and a few others. Welcome to Joan from Montebello, Virginia. When we get started, I'll make this announcement again, but you can ask any questions at any time in the Q&A, and we will answer as many questions as time allows at the end of the presentations. We will be adding the slides from today's presentation to the location where you first joined the webinar. Actually, I'll do that in the time that you are watching the presentation. And the recording for this webinar and other webinars will be available at the same site that you joined as well in the future. So in a couple days, it'll be available again. Welcome to Emma from Keene, New Hampshire and NRCS. Thanks to everybody joining us. We'll get started in a few minutes. Welcome everybody who's joining us. Feel free to tell us where you're coming from in the chat, and I'll announce it to the world, or at least to this webinar audience. We've got Sandra from San Diego County joining us too. Tammy from Waterline Farm in Pryor, Oklahoma. And Amber from Deming, which is way north Washington. Benjamin from Georgia, who's landowner and the farm FSA. Jake, welcome from Mason, Ohio, and Lisa from Lawrenceville, Georgia. John, welcome from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation over in DC. Nick, welcome from the Sky High Farm in the Hudson Valley, and Lisa from NRCS in New York. Paul from Common Ground Eco Village in North Carolina. 75 acres of woodlands. And for those of you just joining us too, the slides from today's presentation will be available at the same link where you joined the webinar. I'll get that done in the time that our presenters are presenting. And the recording of today's webinar and every other webinar in this series will be available within a couple days on the same location where you first joined it. Welcome to Kevin from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Eric from Idaho, Zach from NRCS Connecticut, and Joel from Northeast Ohio, and Emma from NRCS in Vermont. So, and just a reminder, this is like the first webinar of a 6-part series, all on silvopasture. Some great experts. And this is the the 6th season of the Woodland Stewards webinar series, which varies on themes for each year, but you can access all of the Woodland Stewards webinar series by going to this landing page, forestrywebinars.net /sponsor pages, Woodland Stewards. And I'll put that link in the chat box later on. In addition, there's a timber tax webinar series from 2021, which is very, very helpful to anyone who is a landowner of any sort. There's a lot of great information in there. Welcome to Pamela from Virginia and Chad from North Carolina. And after the webinar, just remind everybody if they want to receive a certificate or continuing education units and to reach our evaluation, please click complete the webinar on the screen that you first joined from. That will give you access to receiving your certificate, but also link you to the evaluation, which we appreciate everyone filling out. Welcome to William from North Carolina. And Carl from Green Building Solutions in Exton, Pennsylvania. I think that's the second Exton, Pennsylvania person we have. And we'll get started in about a minute here. And for the future webinars in this series, if you go to each of the webinars, individual webinars, you can export a calendar link. You look in the bottom left of this slide, you'll see where you can find the export to calendar and save your calendar link for future webinars in this series. And I haven't had any emails from people saying they can't join, so everything seems to be smooth sailing so far. All right, we are at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to briefly get started, then I'll leave it to our speakers to get going. So like I said, the slides from today's presentation will be available here at the location where you joined the webinar, and towards the bottom of the webinar, and I'll make those available before the end of the webinar today. The recording will be available at the same location. This is the first of 6 webinars in a series on silvopasture, featuring a ton of experts from across the country. All of these webinars will be held Tuesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 p.m. Central Time, through March 5th. You can find any of the other Woodland Stewards webinars from prior years on the Forestry webinar portal, which is where you initially joined. And I've especially been highlighting the timber tax webinar series from a couple of years ago because that's especially relevant to everybody. Finally, after the webinar, you're going to press a button on the screen that you first joined from to receive a certificate and/or CEUs, which I'll remind you at the end of the webinar. Lastly, this webinar series was brought to you by a team of extension professionals from across the country who've worked together to identify the theme and speakers and generate the content for this. So, and we'll ask you to, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you can see a spot that says Q&A. So please use that to enter any questions at any time. When we get to the end of the presentations, then we will, I'll read out the questions to as many questions as time allows for the speakers to answer. And now we'll hand it over. And my name is Leslie Bobby. I'm from Southern Regional Extension Forestry. So I'll be hosting this webinar and most of the webinars in this series. But I'm going to hand it over now to Ashley Conway Anderson, and I will let her share her screen so she can control it. So go ahead, Ashley, you can.
Okay, thanks so much, Leslie. Let me, oh, there we go. Make this as smooth a handoff as possible here. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here. As Leslie said, my name is Ashley Conway Anderson. I am a silvopasture researcher, faculty at the Center for Agroforestry, University of Missouri. And so my area of expertise, I've been with the center for almost 5 years now. I'm a ruminant nutritionist, animal scientist by training, and my research in the past 5 years at the center has really been diving into the ins and outs of how to make silvopasture work. And so it's been a really exciting process. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, I'll be popping in and out to share some of our research findings and get into a little more of the nitty-gritty. I'm happy to kick it off today and get us started with just a really broad introduction. What the heck is silvopasture? What are we going to be talking about for the next 6 weeks? So we're going to jump in here. This is my interpretation. Silvopasture is an agroforestry practice. Here in the United States, we tend to officially classify these agroforestry practices as these 5 terms here. So they're categorized into windbreaks, forest farming, so using forested areas to create non-timber forest products like mushrooms, repairing forest buffers, alley cropping, and then silvopasture systems. So I always give the caveat here that this ordering from least to most complex is my personal ordering. It's not necessarily rooted in any scientific papers, really coming from how I perceive the complexity of managing that system to be. So, you know, planting a windbreak on the edge of your pasture or your crop field is pretty straightforward. And forest farming tends to be a little pretty straightforward as well, but, you know, we're starting to get a little more involved. Repairing forest buffers can be fairly involved with lots of different species. You bring in wildlife, you bring in water elements into that. Alley cropping, you've got like an actual agricultural crop in there. You might have machinery. Silvopasture, I put at the bottom, and that's not to toot my own horn. It's really more of coming from a place of as soon as we add livestock to a system, in any kind of system, the management and knowledge for managing that system well, I think increases significantly if it's a realm that people aren't familiar with. So I always frame it as we're going to talk about some complicated things. So hopefully by the end we have a better picture of it, but it's going to be okay for a lot of us to say we're not really sure because there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to silvopasture. On the surface, it's pretty straightforward. We're talking about the intentional integration and management of trees, forage, and livestock together in a working, cohesive system. Of course, it can never be that simple, right? When we're talking about multi-factored and multi-tiered systems, we're talking about a system that is flexible and can be applied and modified for a lot of different situations and a lot of different resources. But adding that complexity, like adding that variability and flexibility, ends up creating a real web of interactions, because all of these different species and all of these different items and that you can add to the system, they might each have a different effect. So I call it a la carte agriculture. You really have the opportunity to pick and choose what you want to meet your own goals within the context of what you have to work with as far as your land base and your resources. So sometimes your choices are, you need to take into account like the land that you're on, soil type, climate, what you can manage as far as, tree management or livestock management. But even within that, you have a wealth of options. The combinations are pretty much limitless, right? That tree element in a silvopasture can be for timber. We see that very commonly in the southeast part of the states, but it doesn't have to be timber. You can have a specialty crop silvopasture with nuts or fruit. You can have more of a wild woodland type silvopasture where the trees really primarily form habitat. They can be windbreak trees. They can be fodder trees. In a lot of tropical agriculture systems, the trees provide extra feed resources for livestock, including in addition to the shade. Forages, that can run the gambit as well. Are you wanting just a really lush pasture type thing, or you really want to focus on native species? It can be really wide. And then the animals themselves, it doesn't have to be just cattle. You can have sheep, you can have goats, you can have pigs, you can have poultry, you can have bees. In most states in America, you've got pollinators are technically classified as livestock. So you can have a honeybee silvopasture. I always use that as an example. I think it's super fun. So technically, it can be really flexible. Now, what we tend to find is that in agriculture management, especially, we want clear prescriptive answers. But this inherent flexibility of silvopasture is the curse and the blessing. The very fact that it can be a lot of different things means that it can be very difficult to provide recommendations for how to do it. So we're going to explore a little bit about that going on in the next 6 weeks. I really want to focus on giving us just a little bit of context to the role of silvopasture. What is it? What is the history behind it? And why are we talking about it now? So I always like to remind people that silvopasture is, and agroforestry in general, while we may be calling it something very specific, and in our current day, we have a very specific definition of what it is, the management practices and land use practices behind it are rooted in very old, very traditional practices. And I say globally indigenous, with not a capital I here, because it is really found ubiquitously in a lot of different communities and places around the world. So just touching on a few of those here to give you guys a sense of scope. In Europe, this is a 1310 to 1320 AD Europe. There's a bas relief of harvesting acorn to feed swine. So this represents a official, like, legal term called pannage, which identified a specific time of year that the peasants could bring their pigs and their livestock into the acorn or the oak forest to harvest the acorn to fatten them up. So foraging under oak trees to feed livestock, clearly very old practice in Europe. This is also a relief or a painting from what I assume is a colonizing interloper, if you will, in Australia, but representing some observed practices of using fire to transform the landscape, manage the landscape, and create hunting opportunities. This is something that we see very similarly here in our history in the United States. I'm sure there are lots of folks on the call who have context and experience for this, so I'm going to try not to go too broad for people, but the use of fire in North America by indigenous communities was very intentional for their food system. Creates a mosaic of habitat that promotes food security through managing the understory, creating food patches. It transforms the forage, it transforms the plants, it transforms the trees into a real woodland or savanna type landscape in a lot of places in the US. So fire was the key tool to create essentially a lush grazing space for a lot of large herbivores such as bison and elk and deer. I highly recommend these resources to learn more about it if this is new to you. I've learned a lot about this particular aspect since I joined the Center for Agroforestry, and I encourage you all to read more on it as well. I can't go and talk about the history of silvopasture without referencing the Spanish deheces and the Portuguese montados. This is in the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal. The oldest continuing silvopasture, as we might recognize and define it today, over 2,000 years of continuous grazing among oak trees in this very there's very low density open savanna type ecosystem where livestock are finished on mast and forage. So very strong and old history of silvopasture in Europe as well. And then finally, we've got other instances in the Mediterranean. Historically, this is a picture of sheep grazing in an olive grove in Greece, I believe. You got to remember that managing orchards, again, it's probably not new, managing orchard and specialty crops, keeping the grass down around those trees is important to help get those trees started. And before lawnmowers, were involved or herbicides were invented, livestock were really natural and logical choice for helping manage the forage in these orchard type systems. And this quote here is referencing a relief of or a picture in a 12th dynasty tomb in Egypt showing goats foraging on grapevines after the harvest to help manage that system. So silvopasture is very old, and what we're talking about are land use and animal use and management activities that have a lot of historical context. So why are we talking about it today? Why do we're clearly in a lot of places producing our food differently than these historical systems. Why are we interested in revisiting some of these old practices and giving them a facelift for the modern world, if you will? I won't spend too much time on this figure. I think the important thing in here is that there's a lot of talk about how do we adapt to climate change, particularly when it comes to our food system, and particularly when it comes to our livestock production. And I want to draw your attention here. This is from the IPCC special report from 2019. In agriculture options to improve, mitigate, adapt, and prepare for climate change and try to mitigate some of these challenges we're facing. All of these elements on the side here, we've got improved forest management, reduced forest degradation, improved grazing land management, improved livestock management. All of these elements can be found in silvopasture. In fact, agroforestry itself has its own role up here of having a pretty medium impact on mitigating and adapting to climate change. So we're facing a changing climate. We're facing a very different world than what I think we've seen in the past. And silvopasture has the potential to meet a lot of these challenges and provide some solutions. Again, so this is, what are we talking about here? What is silvopasture? This is a very broad overview. It's important to understand that silvopastures vary. They can look like a lot of different things. Typically, when we talk about silvopasture, however, we're talking about really two main types, if you will, and it's really based on the starting point. Are you starting from a place of already forested area that maybe needs some forest management to reduce that tree density, improve the health of the forest, maybe reduce an invasive mid-story, and make it a more habitable, functional space, whether that's for wildlife habitat, or you can push it a little bit closer to an agriculture system and make it a grazing space. I call this woodland silvopasture. You might also hear silvopasture by subtraction, because you're often removing some trees from this system. Alternatively, where you can plant trees into an already open pasture. So silvopasture by addition, I call this plantation silvopasture. But ultimately, we're talking about reforesting and adding trees back to an open landscape. Um, it's tricky though. The woodland silvopasture, especially, we're going to talk about this silvopasture by subtraction. It gets a little dicey. There's a complicated history with livestock in the woods, and rightly so. This is a picture of a very real place, and it's pretty frightening, right? This is absolutely what we do not want to do. There's a long history of research that has supported not putting animals in forests because of overstocking, poor management of the trees, poor management of the forest itself means low forage production. The animals don't gain well. There's a lot of ecosystem damage. And ultimately, it's led to really kind of the current policy in a lot of places for livestock exclusion to promote forest health. It's important, though, that what we're talking about is not unmanaged woodland grazing. You know, this is damage to a glade here by cattle, a living barn situation in a mud lot. This is not silvopasture. Silvopasture is managed. And these are some of the more current statistics that I have. We don't have clear numbers on how many people are practicing woodland silvopasture and how many people are doing unmanaged woodland grazing. It gets a little dicey on how people are defining inclusion of livestock in forested areas, but people are doing it and we don't know how they're doing it. Are they doing it in a way that's responsible and judicious with low impact, or are we seeing some of these more upsetting situations that we really don't want to be encouraging? This forested farmland term, you know, it could be, I think this is a situation that might look familiar to a lot of people here on this call, but no matter where you are, you have a grazing pasture, and then you have the forest edge, this edge of the trees that's not really been managed, but it's pretty thick, but we're still not going to put animals in there. There's a clear border. However, you know, what we're talking about, whether we're talking about planted silvopasture or not, it really is about intentional management, right? This has been thinned, this has been planted, the invasive species have been removed, and there's not even a fence here. And you can see a very clear line of difference in how that forest looks. And with that, there's a lot of underlying ecosystem services that are coming from managing this landscape. Of course, animals require management too, not just the trees. This is probably the best open range example of range management. We have this is two different properties owned by two different people. One person practices a more intentional and rotational grazing management. This person practices a more heavily stocked, maybe less judicious grazing management, and it matters. It has an impact on the landscape. You know, we're not trying to add to desertification. We're trying to really manage our livestock well and create a functional ecosystem that supports animals and natural habitat. I am going to quickly go through some actual research that has shown that silvopasture can provide a lot of different benefits, environmental benefits, animal production benefits, and economic benefits. I say can and could a lot here because in the body of research, we're not seeing all of these all the time in every case, right? Silvopasture is not a silver bullet. It's not a slam dunk, but it does have the potential, depending on your circumstances, to hit on several of these things if things go well. So improve soil characteristics, nutrient retention, improve water quality, improve biodiversity. Sometimes you might see improved livestock performance or at least equivalent performance, forage quality, tree growth, animal health and well-being, And then just from the fact that you're generating multiple enterprises with silvopasture, you have increased revenue diversity, increased land efficiency, and potentially some increased income. There's some more references. I won't spend too much. Essentially, the theory behind it, and we'll talk about this, when you add shade to a system, you are keeping that forage at a slower growth rate, keeping it lush and physiologically younger for a longer period of time, which is typically higher quality forage. So you have a trade-off in biomass, but an improvement potentially in quality and being able to manage those livestock. I am going to switch here to this final slide here. For the next few sessions, we're really going to be talking about how do we do it? Because I think that's really the next question. I usually don't have to sell people on the benefits of silvopasture. They're very interested in it. The big question really ends up being, how do we go about doing it? So hopefully that's what we can touch on here. We'll have practitioners come in and talk about how they do it, and we're just going to have a good, hopefully long-term conversation about what silvopasture can look like for everybody. Thank you.
Okay, I think next on the schedule is John Fike, and John is the forage extension specialist at Virginia Tech. And I slipped a slide or two in here that you don't have, and we'll get those to you a little bit later, but they're related to resources. And I want to start in that kind of context. So when we talk about silvopastures that are really fully functioning and well-functioning systems, we're thinking about how do we manage the resources and those resources of light, moisture, soil nutrients, the nutrient return, that sort of thing. So a lot of people ask about light. And we have some data. I'm not going to present any today, but there's a number. One slide. But there's when you put the systems together, you really need to think about the components. So what type of forages am I working with? If you're in the deep south or below the transition zone, you may be mostly talking about Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, and or perhaps native warm season grasses. We can do that in the transition zone as well, but we're challenged to manage the light resource sometimes in those systems. C3 plants, however, which are more common in the transition zone and further north, they're light saturated at roughly 50% full sun at the individual leaf level. If we're talking about whole canopy, it's probably more like 60% full sunlight is about where you get light saturated. So you can, well, I would say it the other way. You're losing a lot of the light resource if you're only growing trees in kind of a dispersed fashion, or if you're only growing pasture, because those pasture plants in general, those C3 plants can't take it all. You do see some changes in how that plant partitions nutrients. So if they're shaded, they will put a little bit more of the light resource into leaf growth rather than into root growth. And diffuse light, which is what we have in these systems, so you can imagine a light beam is coming from the sun and it strikes a tree and then it bounces off, or it goes through the tree and kind of gets banged around. It's not all coming down directly impinging on the canopy, but it may be coming down and kind of hitting something and coming at another angle. So you can actually get a little bit more light into the canopy when you have some trees in the system. And it's important to note that, that varies by tree species. Sometimes I show a slide looking at, canopy architecture and thinking about that, but we'll move on. One of the things that happens when you are capturing some of that light in the tree above, well, it creates shading effects. And that's not all bad when you start thinking about soil temperature. Our cool season grasses like the temperatures to be a little bit lower. This pink line represents about 75 degrees, which is roughly the optimum for cool season grass growth. And what you'll notice there then is with the red line, that's the highest line, it's always well above the lines for medium or high density tree plantings. That's low density trees, which is essentially open versus medium or high. And so over time, those low treatments have much hotter soils than the ones that are under some level of shading, and that's not all bad relative to things like moisture. The literature is a little bit mixed. People say, well, what about trees competing for moisture? They do, and they can, particularly shallow rooted trees. Or trees that are very high density. So yes, there's competition, and oftentimes when it gets quite dry, you'll see the grasses brown up around the trees. But in many cases, when people experience some level of kind of light level of drought, I have producers tell me the only green grass I've got is under the tree, and that's because those trees are helping to reduce evapotranspiration and keeping it cooler underneath the tree canopy. Seemed like I'm going backwards there. Sorry about that. So this is the one data, or I made a mistake. I have two data slides I want to show you relative to herbage accumulation. So these are relatively young trees. They're 7 to 8 years old. We had them in at 3 different densities: low, medium, or high density, or low, medium, and high shade density. 2002 is quite dry. 2003 was quite wet. And what we found that on the average, we had about 15% greater forage yield under those moderately spaced trees. Again, not very large, not competing for a lot of the moisture. Now, fast forward to 2017, 2020, and that kind of time frame, we're looking at much larger trees. And what you'll see is that in the black bar, that's black walnut trees. We had underneath those trees, we had much less forage than in the yellow bar, that's a honey locust, or the green would be open pasture systems. So the black walnut trees were larger. They had a more dense canopy than the honey locusts, and they were capturing more light. They might also have had some juglone issues going on there. And you see the red numbers here besides species. That just indicates that there are some changes in composition underneath the forage, or excuse me, underneath the tree canopy. Now, people say, okay, what's that mean for gain? And if we look at these systems, these are summertime studies only, so this is a limitation. We probably couldn't get as much out of the walnut system on a year-round basis, simply because a little bit less productive over time, over the course of the whole year. But when you look at these systems, we have to reduce the stocking rate a little bit to compensate for that lower forage yield during the summer. And over the 3 years of this study, what we see is those animals on black walnut did as well or better than the animals that were on the honey locust or the open pasture systems. And if we consider, so that's average daily gain, that's just how much they're gaining each day. But if we consider how much gain we got out of all the animals over time, we essentially have the same kind of productivity. And hey, we got a tree in the system. Isn't that great? So one of the things that happens, we just kind of showing these data, if you look at the top right, you'll see this kind of light gray line at the top. That is the temperature for animals that are in open pastures, and the lower lines are for those animals in silvopastures. So hey, who knew shade keeps animals cooler? But we also did some measures of cortisol, a stress hormone, and you can see that in these kind of orange blocks. We can see that there are lower levels of cortisol in those animals that are in the silvopasture system. And a lot of the energy sparing that happens for these animals in silvopastures is simply because they lie down more and they spend less time standing. Sometimes I use the analogy, if I give you 100% of the all-you-can-eat buffet, but you have to eat it outside where it's 90 degrees and 85% relative humidity, you probably don't want to eat that much, and you're just going to stand around trying to find some way to be comfortable. If I give you 70% of the all-you-can-eat buffet, but I tell you, you can have it inside in the air conditioning, well, you're probably going to gain more weight if you have the 70% buffet, but you have a more comfortable environment in which to consume it. So I want to throw out one kind of last kind of academic term. We talk about land equivalency ratio. If you think about a forage system, you can grow 100% of the forages that you can grow when there's no trees bothering you, and you can get 100% of the animals that you're going to get with that. That's a land equivalency of 1. And you could do the same thing with trees. Sorry, that should be a nice kind of aqua bar there, whatever, for the trees. You could get you can plant all your trees, you're going to get an equivalency of 1 if that's all you're growing in that kind of monoculture. But when we think about land equivalency, we can even, have some losses in forage production. We might have some losses in animal production. We're not going to be able to have wall-to-wall trees. But if we look at the total productivity of the land unit, it's greater than 1. I used to use, and I stopped the black bar line here at the top, I used to stop at about 120, but the more I read the literature, those numbers are on average in the 140s to 150s. So we have the opportunity to greatly increase land productivity in a period when there's growing demand for resources. So I want to just do a little quick travelogue here about why and how producers are doing it. This is just an example of somebody who thinned a stand and then came back, thinned a stand of pine trees and then came back and planted rows or alleys of tall fescue between. One producer that we've worked with, he was simply interested in hunting, and he ran his beef cattle in there as kind of a secondary enterprise. Other people are interested in the aesthetics, and they will tell you their land values have gone up simply because they think it's more attractive. One guy said he gets more for rent for the people that have a rental house on the property. Another producer had kind of a rough piece of property, and he wanted to do something with it to improve it for intergenerational land transfer, as well as something of a second career. This farmer said, I'm looking for a 2-story agriculture, and you probably will hear from this farmer later in this series. He says, he wants to appreciate his land rather than build a barn and watch it depreciate. So he's looking for multiple crops out of these trees. He's looking for shade for his animals, and he says, my customers get it. They see that I'm trying to take care of my animals. Others, species and product diversity or wetland protection, or even as a way of community engagement. This is a former student. I don't think this is in your slide set, but he's working with timber stands that are leased, and he can use low capital outlay to develop the system, ran goats through to clean out invasives, and then established forages underneath them. Other younger mindset, just looking for something different. Heat stress abatement and timber management. This individual, rather than cutting out big swaths, is taking out individual pine trees over time. Heat stress abatement, if you ask producers, is probably the #1 reason that people are interested in this. I leave you, or I put this slide in. You can find this playlist of producers, and I'll put this back on here again. One of the things I find is really fascinating is that producers are coming up with solutions for how to get trees into place and protected. In this case, this is Wynn Miller, and what she's doing is she's putting hotline directly onto the tree tube. The tube uses a plexiglass or fiberglass stake to hold that tube in place, and then she can run the wire down the tube to keep the cattle off of it so it's not a scratching post. There are a lot of new opportunities and support and markets that are driving this. And so these are just a few of the names. I think Brett will talk to you a little bit about Project Drawdown. The one that I'm involved with, to go back to this, is Working Trees. We have a conservation innovation grant, and we will pay people to put shade trees in, and that gives some support on the front end. But then those producers are also signing a contract for long-term carbon market access, and they would get some carbon payment. All right, so there was a question in the chat earlier about, can you do this for horses? And this is not the best image because it's a much smaller on our website, but this is a horse amongst a number of trees out in a pasture. It's not particularly intentional, but they have something of a working silvopasture in this context. If you go, this is, you could Google silvopasture and VCE for Virginia Cooperative Extension. It will bring you to this page. I would point you again to this video section, and this producer's perspectives gives you people from Georgia and Alabama and into North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, showing lots of different ways that they are approaching this. That's my email address if you want to contact me. And it's now my turn to hand the baton to Brett.
Don't hand it all the way though. John has agreed to advance my slides so that I don't mess this up here in the final stretch of our presentation. Speaking of horses, we used to have adopted thoroughbreds that we kept out there on our silvopastures, and if there's any animal that could get itself in trouble in a pasture environment, it would be those particular horses, and they loved it. They did fine. They were out there pasture buddies with the cattle and the sheep and the goats for years. And then I had a friend come along that really needed some extra horses on his farm, and off went the thoroughbreds. Okay, I'm going to share a little synopsis of what we do on our grazing farms. And we've been doing this, I guess, going back almost 30 years now. Next slide, please. My experience with silvopasturing started in 1992 in Argentina. I worked there in forestry, international forestry, and worked closely with large ranching operations, many of whom had forestry backgrounds. And for them, it was a simple, like, why not kind of question. You know, they could grow productive plantations and improve the grazing and rangeland at the same time for their livestock. And these were very symbiotic systems. The cattle grazing was really a crucial part of controlling the fuel loads to minimize fire risks during the dry, warm winter season, and also help shift it from high silica wire grasses more to more palatable cool season grasses, and intercept more of the intense rainfalls and reduce flash flooding. The government was behind this because it was a very important source of rural employment. These ranches typically would employ one family for a 10,000 acre ranch. And when you'd start adding in all the work to grow seedlings and plant them and care for them and prune them and eventually harvest them and mill them into lumber, it was a huge increase in the rural economic employment opportunities. Next slide, John. Maybe in a future talk, I'll throw all my slides back in there of my favorite Argentine barbecues with huge slabs of meat on the grill, but in the sake of time today, I took those out. We moved back to our family's old dairy farm in the early 2000s with a young family, looked around the brush-filled pastures and the crop to death fields, and decided we were no longer going to be dairy farmers, nor the dairy farming phased out in the mid 80s when the cheap child labor went off to college. And when I came back about 16, 17 years later, though, grazing really seemed to be the best fit. We started raising a grass-fed herd on our ranch in central Argentina in the mid 90s. My wife is from a large farming family there. We bought our own ranch in 1994, finally found enough money and time to start planting trees and raising cattle on it a few years later. Got things up and running there, moved back to New York. We still continue to ranch there today, thanks to some great people that have kept it afloat all these years. Maybe another presentation for another time of all the joys of being an absentee or somewhat absentee farmer. But today I'm going to continue to talk about just what we do here on our farm in upstate New York. We're in Watkins Glen, New York. We're a 500 acre grazing operation with about 110 cow-calf pairs. Next slide, John. Ashley talked about the two directions from which we can be creating silvopastures. We have both on both of our farms here in New York, pretty broad mix of both silvopastures that we've created by planting trees into treeless pastures, as well as taking existing farm woodlands, that in many cases had a variety of forest health issues like heavy invasive shrub understories, and going about thinning both the upper canopy as well as the lower strata in those woods to move that sunlight to where we can grow forages with it. Next slide. And Ashley talked a little bit about our long history of woodland grazing. To me, one of the key things that differentiates silvopasturing from putting livestock in the woods, which we've been doing here for a long time. It's hard to find a farm woodlot up this way that doesn't have an old barbed wire or woven wire fence around it, is this rotational grazing, and not just mediocre rotational grazing. It's, you really get out of it what you put into it. So it takes both skill and some intensive management. That's a picture there, the part of our farm, and you can see that's a fairly dated map, but even this is probably 15 years ago, you can already see the level of paddock subdivision there, where we have things chopped up into lots of 3 to 4 acre paddocks. In my case, I have permanent paddocks only because I work regionally as an extension forester. Cornell gets the first 50 hours a week. I want to show up 5 minutes before dark and be able to pop a gate open, and the cows are good for another 24 hours. Next slide. Yeah, another thing that I think is really important in silvopasture systems is that we learn to use livestock as the vegetation management tool. We don't have a lot of the traditional tools at our disposal when trees and stumps and branches and shrubs are in the way, like brush hogs or spray rigs. And we certainly can't just plow it up and start over again. So we need to be very skilled managers, understand the animal behavior, what they're looking to get out of it, which is basically food, and um, work with that animal behavior and those characteristics of all the different types of livestock. And I don't think we've quite brought it up yet, but I mean, the horses touches on this a little. I think all species of livestock can work in silvopasture systems, but certain species may be more appropriate at given stages in the life cycle of a silvopasture. Nonetheless, I think that silvopastures really can work with, again, that skilled grazing management with just about any livestock species. Next slide. And much of what we're striving to achieve with our livestock is, I think of it as good animal impacts, and we all on this um, meeting today, I think, understand or have some good images in our head of bad livestock impacts. Certainly woodland grazing in the past, there were plenty of bad livestock impacts associated with that woodland grazing, animals girdling high value trees or compacting soils. But one thing that we do here on our farm that's probably is peculiar to many local farmers is the silvopasturing is winter bale grazing. And we try to feed a lot of those bales in our silvopasture areas when the ground is frozen. We have lots of frozen ground conditions here normally in a winter. This winter has been very abnormal, very mild and wet so far. But whenever it's frozen, we'll move them in there and try to feed those bales. Another forester, grazer friend of mine, Joe Orifice, who's a Yale agroforester, calls these bale bombs. And if you do the math, if you put 20 hungry bovines around a round bale, devouring it for several hours in that 30-foot diameter impact zone, you have over 1.5 million pounds of density per acre, which is much more than we can achieve during the normal grazing season. I see a question in the chat box about rolling out the bales. No, we drop them in the middle of the patches of soft brush and let the animals do the rest. And it's not like a one and done thing where the bad plants just give up and go away. But if you periodically do that, you're helping to shift it away from what wants to encroach on these higher sunlight disturbed silvopasture understory sites to more a more stable herbaceous understory. And in addition to that trampling and smashing effect, you're also getting the fertility and the seeding benefits that bale. Next slide, please, John. And uh, John started to stumble into this a little bit. Well, not stumble, but I think we've all resisted so far today getting off into the messy weeds of the silvicultural discussions around silvopasturing. But uh, because this is really one of the most frequently asked questions when we're already starting with existing trees, is another key um, component of the woodlot silvopastures is that we're going to have to reduce the density through what's known in forestry terms as thinning. And in a typical farm woodlot, many of the trees growing there are trees that are not never going to grow into what we would think of as a desirable or high value tree. Many are going to be pulpwood, firewood quality trees. So if we remove those trees, and you can see what those trees look like in the log landing in the lower picture there, a lot have defect and decay and voids and rot. In the standing trees, they may look like lovely little trees, but and they're the trees that are losing the race for the blue sky. Then we can reallocate that sunlight from somewhere above the ground surface down to about the ground surface where we can grow productive quality forages for our animals. And without getting into discussions today about stocking and relative density, I think what we're really aiming for in most situations is to maintain about a 50% closed or open canopy. And for some of those forages, particularly the warm season forages, John talked about this. You maybe need something more like a 60 to 70% canopy, and not all tree canopies are created the same. By the way, think of like a maple or a spruce canopy versus kind of an open pine or aspen canopy. Next slide. Yeah, so these are Ashley and John talked a lot about some of the benefits of silvopasturing. Here's a list I came up with for our own farm once upon a time. We could take any one of these and talk about it at length. Next slide. Here's a obvious one that didn't make it onto my original list. We can just be growing multiple valuable things on the same land and doing it in a synergistical way. Next slide. This book came out some years back, and it shifted silvopasturing into from being sort of this fringe thing that some weirdos did to now it's like cool, and all the policymakers can talk about it because it ranks really well. Silvopasturing does for its carbon and climate benefits. Next slide. Um, you know, these are obviously composite findings of silvopasturing experiences from all over the world, but it stacks up very well to the treeless pasture situations or many straight forestry situations. But the two I'd like to point out and to wrap up what I'm covering about from the farmer perspective are those two that I've highlighted there at the bottom: resilience and adaptation. Next slide. Um, I'm sure that those of you I see many of us today are from the Northeast, but many from other parts of the country. We all experience these types of adverse weather events to some degree, and I know that people from out west would laugh at us when we talk about having drought here in the Northeast. But if it doesn't rain for a few weeks here, you start to see conditions that look like in that upper picture, everything's starting to burn up and the dust is flying and the cool season grasses have really lost their quality. These were two pictures taken a few days apart during a 2011 drought. And you can see in the cooler, shadier silvopastures there, the cows are not just up to their bellies, they're literally up to their backs, and a whole smorgasbord of good stuff. Last slide, please, John. And part of what we do here beyond silvopasturing is more of a comprehensive outwintering strategy. Winter is a season that can bring a lot of weather that it may not be so uncomfortable for our animals, but I lay in bed at night and feel better when I can give them shelter, and instead of building structures for hundreds of thousands of dollars, which will never pencil out for a beef cattle operation like ours, we have these mixed conifer plantations that we thin, not so much with the objective of growing a lot of productive forage underneath, but we can move our animals there during those handful of days every winter when it gets really ugly. So that's it for my slides.
Great. Thank you so much, Brett, Ashley, and John and Colby. We're going to move to some Q&A now. And we have various questions. If you do have further questions, please ask them in the Q&A, and we'll proceed from there. And I do want to warn people, I'll pull it up in a second, but that if you want to get credits, if you want to get credit for attending this webinar or continuing education credits, make sure you complete the process at the end of this webinar. So let's see, we'll start with a few different questions. We have one that's asking, how does silvopasture affect soil health and water quality? And anyone can answer this question, so just jump in.
Well, don't everybody speak at once. So, again, I think you're back to these kinds of, it depends. So let's maybe start from the assumption that it's well managed. And then I would say the answer is it has the opportunity, or you have the opportunity to benefit the system. I think Ashley has done a recent review on some of the environmental impacts, and she really would be the better one to speak to this. So I'll turn it to her.
Well, and I see I've been trying to keep up on the Q&A, so but I hope you all don't mind. I haven't been able to get to everybody in the typing questions, but I've seen a couple of comments that relate also to compaction and soil quality and water. And I think all of those kind of go together. So again, I think John's point of let's assume that it's a well-managed, well-grazed system. We're talking about the livestock typically have less time to exert like a significant impact, and that impact is much more managed disturbance, and it will have more positive effects. Overgrazing is going to be the biggest predictor of soil compaction, damage to trees, poor forage diversity base, really a lot of the negative things we would see. So I'm going to try to answer all of it together. When we add trees, woody perennials to like for instance, a pasture system, we're adding a lot of potential for carbon sequestration, organic matter, you're improving soil microbiomes. There's a lot of good research that shows enhancing diversity of these systems and creating a more multi-functional, multi-dimensional ecosystem really has a lot of positive effects on all of these aspects. You'll have more resistance to compaction. Stronger forage base will create more resistance to compaction and improve water filtration and runoff. You're going to see changes in the soil microbiome. You're going to see changes in wildlife diversity in like smaller mammals, invertebrates, etc. So it's hard to draw large conclusions and say things, for certain what exactly we would see in every situation. But I think there's enough evidence in the literature to indicate that a well-managed silvopasture with judicious grazing really, like John said, benefits a lot of these things, and we don't see as much risk for some of the negative effects we would expect to see in a poorly managed system. So hopefully that captures a lot of folks' questions to that.
And this is why I think the rotational grazing is so key. I should have been more specific about this, but across like the farm here in New York, we're grazing about 500 acres and 120 permanent paddocks with about daily rotations. So to put that in other terms, we're only have the cows in any given spot for a day at a time, a few times a year. And one of the other beauties of rotational grazing is that you can look ahead at the 10-day forecast, and when you see it's going to be really soggy, you don't maybe move them into the most sensitive areas. So it just gives us greater flexibility to move the animals where it's the most appropriate for the given conditions at the time.
I'll follow up a little bit. There's a question here about if silvopasture is a feasible option in wet floodplain type environments to help manage sites that currently have too much moisture at certain times of year. I
When
think
it
you kind of
when
referred
it
to that.
doesn't have too much moisture, those are excellent sites for that.
Well, so that would be species dependent. I think I've seen some data. I was trying to find it recently. I can't put my finger on it, but out of Australia, where they were planting trees to tap moisture out of soils and to make those soils a little bit more useful, as it were. Walnuts will tolerate wet sites, willows, poplars. There's probably a number of species, that alder, that would put some nitrogen back in the system for you. And so, tree species, I think, can be found. Do you get enough dry days or sufficiently dry days to make that work? How do you manage the tree canopy so that you're not holding too much moisture in, but it's a tree that likes that moisture and is pumping it out for you. So, those are the kind of considerations you would have to make that kind of system work in that environment.
I would also add that I think in the grazing research, so just not necessarily silvopasture, we're not talking about trees added to the system. In pasture and grazed cropland situations, the biggest risk for compaction comes during really wet grazing events. So it would be like John said, you'd want to make sure that the trees are actually doing what you're hoping to do and really remove a lot of that moisture through competition, and that you're not grazing a wetland. Because I think that does tend to create some potential risk for compaction and maybe too much disturbance of not really what we'd be looking for. The animals wouldn't be removing the water. The trees would be removing the water and creating a more dry environment. So we would be looking at the trees doing a lot of that work rather than the livestock.
So there was a comment or a question about, getting people to rotationally graze. And I think Brett summed this up. I like to say livestock are terrible make terrible land managers, or they are terrible land managers, but they make really great land management tools. And I think, whether somebody's too busy because they've got an off-farm job, or they just couldn't be bothered, or, they got too much money from some other resource and they don't want to fool with the management aspect. But I think that's really the key, is helping people figure out how to make that management work. But they have to, I wouldn't start with somebody who has no clue about rotational stocking on a farm. If I did, I mean, I'd have to be there holding their hand all the time, because they've got to have that. That's kind of a fundamental piece of it, right? So those are questions. And so just back to this question about, do silvopastures impact tree quality? And, Brett may be the best, or better, Ashley, better than me to speak to that. But again, it gets back to, how did you manage that site? Because yeah, they could damage that tree, but they don't have to damage that tree.
Mm-hmm. So I do have another question about, do you see collateral damage to tree roots when you're first introducing livestock into forested stands? Kind of specifically focusing on like when the initial introduction of cattle into woodlands that have been managed only for tree production historically, so and particularly for mixed hardwood stands.
I'm going to answer that a little differently. We have to keep in mind that if we beat up on our pastures or our lawn or our gardens, we can see the symptoms of that really quickly. If we beat up on our woods, we may not see the damage that we caused until many years down the road. And once we see that, those symptoms of, say, soil compaction or compromised root systems, it's too late to reverse that in our trees. So I think all the foresters on the call today get that. It may not be as apparent to people coming from this more from a agronomy background, but just because you beat the snot out of the site and the trees leafed out again the next spring, or if it's conifers, they didn't die, doesn't mean you didn't cause damage. But again, it all comes down to skill grazing and having the ability to move animals and let areas rest and recover too.
So, well, and I would add, it might even start before you bring the animals in, right? If you're using any sort of heavy equipment to thin those stands, and even if the equipment operator does a great job, depending on species, you know, the degree of thinning, the trees that you selected, let's say you took the dominant ones because you wanted to release the smaller ones that didn't happen, you know, that can all affect the quality of that timber and the health of that stand down the road before you even, you know, brought a cow or a ruminant around.
Yeah, it's not like we're never going to do a little bit of harm or impact to our trees, but we want to avoid the real preventable stuff like girdling trees, causing long-term chronic stresses to the trees because of heavy compaction to the roots or pugging to the roots. But trees
We
can
are
bounce back from a lot of stuff.
Yeah. We are at the top of the hour, and I'm going to respect everybody's time here. So just want to mention that this is the first webinar in the series. I think they did a great job, and I want to thank Ashley, John, Brett, and Colby. And we'll be diving into some of these topics a little bit more. In addition, I know we weren't able to answer many questions, and there were a lot of great questions, but I'll be sharing them with the speakers and for future presentations so that they might think to touch on some of these issues. In addition, just want to remind you that you can, if you want to get a certificate of credit or receive continuing education credits, that when you close this down, please click on the orange button in the other screen. This will also take you to the evaluation, and we welcome any feedback. So I will let everybody go, but if the speakers want to answer like a couple more questions, I'll let people linger, but I want to make sure they can finish up. Anyone who needs to leave can leave. So.
Well, yes, thank you, Leslie. What I wanted to finally add, I see so many fantastic questions, and I will say that a lot of these questions we're going to continue to address in the later series in the later webinars in the series. So keep bringing those questions. We hope that you have the opportunity to attend all of these, and hopefully by the end of all of this, we'll have most of them answered as best we can.
And I think the last webinar, we'll have all the producer presenters back on and kind of an open panel for those producers for people to ask questions to what I say, the real experts, the ones that are actually doing it on the ground on an everyday basis like Brett. So
Great.
you will be able to ask those questions on that final webinar.
I will say there was one question about ticks. Is there fewer ticks in silvopasture? And I am curious about that one. But
I'm good at picking up ticks whenever I'm in the silvopasture, but I can in the pasture, open pasture as well. So I don't know.
yeah, that's a good question.
It's an N of one. What's your sense of that, Brett?
You know, there was a grad student from University of Missouri that was here at our farm several years back looking at that very issue, and his hypothesis was that there were fewer ticks in the silvopastures, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but he had a good explanation of why. And I don't know if COVID derailed his research, but I never got the final report out on that.
Are you talking about Ryan DeBala? So I think
that name doesn't ring a bell. But
I think, okay, I'll try to follow up because I think I know exactly what you're talking about, and the research wasn't published, but it has been included in some of our internal like reports within the center. I'll follow up on that and try to touch on it in the livestock session.
yeah, I'm hoping for fewer ticks because
Me
that to me would
too.
be the number one selling point of
Yeah.
more silvopastures.
I do know that there is literature to show that there are fewer ticks in burn stands or burn pastures. So if prescribed burning is used as a tool, there are fewer ticks afterwards. So one positive. Lord knows we could all use fewer ticks.
So there's a similar question here about parasites. And again, that gets back to management. You know, how frequently are they on the site? the silvopastures can hold more moisture, which can make it a little better for parasites as an environment. But if the rotation is long enough that such that they're not coming back to that, that reduces that risk. So there are all these, again, sorry to give you that professorial, it depends answer, but that's kind of where it is.
One question that we had that I think's interesting is, how does Brett have water available in so many paddocks?
We use a little bit of everything from surface water to piped water to energy-free waters this time of the year that we have scattered around the farm when everything else is frozen solid.
Sounds good.
I definitely don't haul water, because I'd be hauling water all day long from sun up to sundown to water 200 head of cattle.
I would love to stay and keep answering all these questions because I talk about silvopasture for hours. I do have another meeting, so thank you so much for organizing this, Leslie, and thank you so much, my co-presenters and everybody attending. I really appreciate it, and I really hope that we can touch on a lot of these topics coming up here. So thank you so much.
That's perfect note to end on. Thanks everybody for joining, and thanks to our speakers, and we look forward to a great series. So have a great day. The recording of this will be available in the next couple days, and the slides should already have been added to the link where you first joined the webinar. So thanks so much, everyone. Always takes me a while to find my stop share button. Yeah, that was great. I will see you guys next week, or Brett, we'll see you at the final webinar on the 5th, where we bring back all the producers for a chat. So
Yeah, I'll see
You
you on
want
the
me to
5th,
stop
but I think
recording, or you,
yeah,
Leslie?
I'll go ahead and stop recording. That's fine.
Okay.